somebody in your organization uses a computer to pay bills. That's where I feel like there's a lot of miss here. Somebody's sending the email and they're waiting for an opportunity to strike. They are criminals. They're not stupid. It is a business model. So they spoofed up a pretty good looking invoice. One of the only things that changed was where to send the money. In 2023, 80% of small businesses had some sort of social engineering attack because they think, oh, I'm not a techie company. You still pay us. You're not protecting 80% of your revenues.
Joe, I've wanted to have this conversation for a while. Really appreciate you joining and talking about this. And we end up talking with companies a lot about cybersecurity, right? It's a big topic for a lot of people. And what's always been missing from that conversation for me is the other side of it, which is we have this impact in what cybersecurity insurance is. And a lot of times maybe the tooling is to help reduce premiums on your policies, but there's also this insurance angle of it. So I'm really happy to be able to talk about that and to get into, what else happens here for companies.
Sure.
And if you could, we're gonna talk about one specific example, and if you could set the stage for me and give me a little bit of background and talk about company industry, like pre-event, like what are the what was going on?
Sure. Yeah. So just disclaimer, no company names will be shared, whether it's the insurance carriers or the actual private entities, but we will give industry, we'll give size, scope, things of those nature that can make the story relevant, right, and hit home to those that may be similar. So in this instance, this was not too long ago, within the last 30 days, actually. We had a manufacturing client who has two entities, a parent entity and a subsidiary entity. The parent entity has been around for many years, 20 plus years. They're a component parts, widget manufacturer, primarily rubber and metal goods, small gaskets, bolts, nuts, nothing compelling or nothing hazardous or no dangerous finished goods or anything like that. Very much a small widget manufacturer. They take up a decent amount of square footage. They have a good sized local operation, 15, 20 million in annual revenue or sales. So it's a good sized local private employer, right? Not too long ago, they spun up a subsidiary company and it shares manufacturing floor space with them. It does have its own tax ID. It does have its own set of employees. And the reason it was spun up as a subsidiary was because of the fact that while it's also in manufacturing, it does something different. So if you've ever received a package and that package might have an item that's breakable in it, there's those foam inserts that protect that package. They cut those foam inserts to spec. So they get big sheets of foam. They take, essentially a razor blade, and they make the incisions and cuts to fit the spec of the manufacturer that has the finished good that needs the foam to pack the product, right? So they've spun this subsidiary up. So here's these two companies. They are owned by the same husband and wife. They're both local Phoenix private companies in the manufacturing space. So there's the scene of who they are,
and
what they do.
And manufacturing, even when you get into like high-tech CNC process automation, a profile for that company is maybe a few people in an office on computers, and then a lot of people on a line, whether that's running the line, producing the product, doing quality control, shipping and receiving, warehousing functions. And like I've seen in a lot of cases where you might have a manufacturer that's got 500 employees, but maybe there's only 50 in a front office or in these like front office roles. So I would say similar probably profile here is just where I go.
Yeah, very standard overview there of how the employee layout is going to be within a manufacturing firm. Very much, it's going to be on the production side is where the payroll is going to skew, right? You talked about higher tech manufacturing CNC machines, and I think that's a little bit prescient to this story as well. So the widget side, the rubber and metal gasket bolt side, that is CNC based. So those are IoT devices.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas you can imagine the cutting of the foam is not CNC based, that is manual labor,
Mm-hmm.
right? So not as high tech manufacturing, if you will. And that's prescient in this way. So the subsidiary entity was the entity that ended up having the cyber breach event. Now,
wait, but before we get into that,
yeah.
I don't want to say the problem, but and I'm curious for your feedback on this and what you experience, right? Because you're helping companies acquire insurance, right?
Right.
We help people acquire technology. You help people acquire insurance. So you have a similar conversation with a similar company.
Right.
A lot of times, especially in the non-tech spaces, people will say, "Oh, we're not doing anything that we need cyber insurance for. We're not at risk. We're not a
Yeah.
target." Like you hear these statements all the time. And for me, it's like, well, if you're connected to the internet and you have email, you're a target. Like you're just
Yeah.
there. And
Yep.
and without throwing anybody under the bus too much, like how much of that applies here in terms of, what sort of base infrastructure do they have or protections do they have in place around this? Were they on the, like, we've got some, maybe we've seen this happen to our friends, we've got more, or like, how do they approach this before?
Yeah. Yeah. So they have a relatively limited IT budget.
Mm-hmm.
It is outsourced, but it is probably not as robust as a spend could be for a company of that size. Let's put it right. Interestingly enough, and I think maybe I'll back up a little bit and share the high level structure of what a cyber liability policy is, based on where you
Yeah.
were going with it. You see people have a sensitivity if they feel that they're more connected to the internet, if they feel like they use the internet more to generate revenue, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a cyber liability policy at its core is three components. There's a first party component. So you're the named insured. We'll use our firm as the example, so we don't have to name anybody else, right? So if Arizona Group is the named insured on the cyber policy, first party coverage agreements are those that would provide dollars to the Arizona Group for costs that they would incur as a result of a cyber breach event. So things like lack of ability to generate income because we can't access our network, reputational harm
Mm-hmm.
because the story went out on Channel 3 that we were breached,
Mm-hmm.
so on and so forth, right? So first party is protecting or indemnifying the named insured policyholder for costs that they would incur as a result of that breach event. Third party is the protection or indemnification for those organizations that you interact with. It could be a material supplier. It could be a vendor of a SaaS product. It could be a financial institution, so on and so forth. It could be all three of these things, right? So in the event that the breach originates in your house, but somehow affects them or impacts them negatively, and you're held liable for that,
Mm-hmm.
that's where that third party component kicks in. So you see more sensitivity around those two issues. And while those have a severity component, right? If you're seeing a loss that impacts those coverage agreements, it's more likely to be a large loss. Here's where I feel like a lot of people lack the sensitivity and take the miss. So the third component is cybercrime. So this is the digital movement of money, right?
Okay.
Whether you are a very sophisticated tech business or not, or whether you're cutting sheets of foam with a razor blade, in 2025, somebody in your organization uses a computer to pay bills, right?
Yep.
So you can be the least technical company on earth, but somebody, at least one person in your
Mm-hmm.
organization, uses a computer to pay bills. And if that's the case, that's where I feel like there's a lot of miss here and a lot of lack of sensitivity where there should be sensitivity. So invoice manipulation, phishing, fraudulent inducement, any of your social engineering type attacks are what you're looking to cybercrime for coverage on, right? So that was the case here. Just like any other manufacturer, technical or non-technical, the subsidiary entity that cuts the foam, they order large batches of foam.
Mm-hmm.
Their main supplier had an invoice be spoofed by a bad actor, and they paid the bad actor the spoofed invoice.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Not great. Okay, so let's back up a second. Let's talk about
Sure.
what that attack looks like in practice, right? When I say
Yeah.
attack, right? You know,
Yep.
I mean, it is an attack, right? So
Yep.
how do these start? You know, you rattle off a few different like social engineering attacks, right? But we can talk about those in
Yep.
different. But it all comes back to the same thing, which I think is pretty basic, right?
Yeah. So many times you're looking at business email compromise, right? So you've got
By the way,
hackers.
can we just talk about how I love the acronyms in tech and cybersecurity specifically? And now it's business email compromise is BEC, which sounds like something your cat does when it's coughing up a hairball. It's kind of going,
It does.
You know?
I'll let you know. I resisted the urge to say lolbass. So So I was trying to not go into
Oh.
acronym world and go into living off the land binaries and scripts, right?
I'm in a spicy mood this morning apparently because I wanted to do my cat impression, right? But I
Yeah.
can't help it. You know. Anyway, sorry.
No, you're fine, right? So lawbass being a very elegant attack, right? But I think in these cases it's more of a BEC, a business email compromise type approach. So somebody's sitting in the network, they're sitting in the email, and they're waiting for an opportunity to strike. This could be, a known time of the month when invoices are coming in or being exchanged for reoccurring orders, like your main, material from your main supplier. It could be when an executive who normally handles something is on vacation, and maybe there's an opportunity to fool someone. Hey, I'm in the Caymans and I need a gift card. Send
Hmm.
it over here, kind of thing, right? Um, but definitely sounds to me like business email compromise, right?
Right. And you said a couple of things that are also really important. I want to come back to a little bit down the road, which was, you know, they could be on the network, they could be in your email. You know, this is something where maybe a compromise has happened in previously, and they've done some profiling, and they know it's like, okay, you know, here's suppliers and here's timeline, and they're going to develop a little intelligence. And by the way, this isn't from the standpoint of like, I need to be in your email for 60, 90 days. This could just be like, I'm getting into your email and I can just read back 60, 90 days and just look for patterns and things, right?
Of course, yeah, and I think it's important to. I know this has been mentioned in many conversations, but it should continue to be mentioned. They are criminals. They're not stupid.
They're really good at their job. Yeah.
Right, right. Like, yes, it is illegal. Yes, it is unethical. Yes, it is immoral. But they are good at it, and it
Yeah.
is a business model, right? So,
Okay.
yeah,
So I feel like we're going to jump forward and backwards a little bit, which is fine, right? So, um, I want to remind me. I want to come back to how email was compromised, but let's talk about the attack and the attack unfolding, right? Which is, you
sure.
know, they're in the email and they see this vulnerability, and what happens?
So essentially, they decided that they thought the office manager who usually pushes the button on bills was someone that they could target,
Mm-hmm.
and they had discovered enough intelligence to say, okay, this is clearly the main supplier of the phone. They make a regular order every month. The order is somewhere in this bandwidth depending on needs for the month, but it's pretty tight within a 10 to 15% range.
Mm-hmm.
This is what their invoice looks like. This is where they normally send the payment, so on and so forth. So they spoofed up a pretty good looking invoice, and as you can imagine, one of the only things that changed was where to send the money. Right? It was a regular type amount. It was the right logo. It was the right format. All of the above, and the office manager pushed play on that payment and sent $64,000 to the wrong person.
How I feel so bad for this person. Um, and by the way, this is not unusual. Like this is not like, I think for anybody, if you're listening to this or you're watching this, right? Like this isn't a This is every day. This happens every day, right? And that's
Yeah.
what's so frustrating about it is like every day this is happening to somebody. I feel really bad for this person. Okay. $64,000 goes out to the wrong place.
Yep.
What happens next?
So you're going to look to, an order of operations, if you will, as how you're going to try to.
Well, how long did it take them before they even realized that $64,000 went to the wrong place?
They figured it out pretty quick. They figured it out within 48 hours,
That's
right?
pretty fast. Yeah.
Which is fairly fast, but in the notion of trying to claw those funds back, it may be a little slow, right? So
Yeah.
you go through an order of operations in these events, and unfortunately, there's been a shift because of the amount of activity in one of those order operations. So I'll share that when I get there. Obviously, if you can claw that money back and just make yourself whole by clawing the money back, that's your
Move
first
on. No
priority.
harm, no foul. Yep.
Yep. So if that's available to you, you can catch it in time, you can claw the money back, stop payment, whatever it may be. Obviously, that's the most ideal outcome. Well, if that's not the case, the money is now gone. The next step is you're going to want to talk to your financial institution, right? Now, this is where the shift has started to happen, and this is because you know as well as I do, a lot of cyber breach events are self-report right now, so it's hard to gain real insight as to how many people are affected or to what scale. But estimations in 2023 were that 80% of small businesses had some sort of social engineering attack.
Okay. Wait. This is a 2023 stat.
Yep.
Just repeat it one more time for me. So in 2023, what percentage of small businesses had
80% had a social engineering event in 2023. So this is very common, and again, that's why I say the cybercrime piece is where I feel like there's not as much sensitivity as there should be, and where people are taking a miss because they think, oh, I'm not a techie company, right? You still pay us. So you've got this financial institution perspective because of the frequency that where they used to say, okay, we will give you the funds back, and we will probably make you sign up for some sort of fraud training, and we'll probably make you approve all your payments daily for the next 6 months kind of thing, but we will give you $64,000 back. That's mostly going away. So now they're saying, all right, we will try to help you claw the money back. But if we can't claw the money back within 30 days, you're on your own. Or if we can't claw it back within 60 days, you're on your own. And the money's gone. So in this instance, they waited the timeline to see if the FI could claw the money back. The FI was unsuccessful in clawing the money back. And so now you're on your own. The $64,000 is not coming back. So the next order of operations is, do we have any sort of insurance policy, like a cyber liability policy, that could help us here, that could, subject to a deductible, reimburse us the rest of the funds. So our loss is really the deductible at this point rather than the full $64,000, right? Well, that's where this story is a little bit interesting and has a little bit of a twist. So because the parent company, the larger company, is IoT devices, CNC machines, it's a larger operation, the parent company did have a cyber liability policy. The subsidiary entity, because it was a smaller entity, a startup entity, non-technical manufacturing, non-IoT, did not have a policy. But if you've been doing this for a while, like I have, one of the things is that within every insurance policy, not just cyber liability insurance policies, there are clauses as to whether or not subsidiaries can qualify for coverage and under what context or circumstances. So in this case, we were able to use that subsidiary clause to find coverage for the subsidiary entity, even though it did not have a primary policy. So is that good news in this anecdote? That's good news in this anecdote. Should the subsidiary entity have its own policy? Yes, it absolutely should. Because as I read you some of these verbiages, if you'd like, right, you'll see quickly that clause is not going to save most people most of the time. We got a little lucky here, right?
Not to disparage insurance, but insurance companies make money by not paying out money, right? Like the more money you pay out, like a hurricane comes through Florida.
Yeah.
If you're doing business with an insurance carrier that has any exposure to a hurricane in Florida, you're going to get an email that says basically X, Y, and Z is now happening as a result of this nationwide. Um, you know,
So I want to address that real quick because that's
yeah.
just not how insurance companies make money, right?
Okay.
Insurance companies are very low margin companies, and
Right.
I'll explain that. They make money by investments and by volume into investments. They do not make money collecting policy premium. Many times they lose money collecting policy premium. So when you look at any insurance carrier, the way they iterate how successful they are is what they would call a combined ratio. So a combined ratio is fixed expenses plus claims dollars paid out divided by premiums collected, right?
Mm-hmm.
So your fixed expenses, you know what those are. Those are your payroll, your billing
Yeah.
overhead, all that stuff. The thing you don't know each and every year is what claims dollars you'll pay out.
Mm-hmm.
You're essentially running a business without knowing what your cogs are, which is a challenge,
Mm-hmm.
right? Um, so a successful insurance company, if an insurance company had an awesome year, right, where they were considered to be a very profitable company, they would run a 93, 94, 95% combined ratio, which means their margin was 5 to 7 cents on every dollar. It's not a high margin industry. They do not make money simply by collecting premiums. The
Mm-hmm.
way they make money is all those 5 and 6 and 7 cents that they collect from hundreds of thousands of clients that total out to a good sum of money gets invested.
Mm-hmm.
And the interest on that large investment is where the profit comes from. They don't make money by solely collecting premiums.
Well, not solely collecting premiums, right? But like,
Yeah,
understand what your loss ratio is or what your payout ratio then affects that number pretty significantly, right? And
it does. And so, if you look at like, say, auto, for example, everybody's feeling stress on their auto, whether it's personal auto or commercial auto. The reason people are feeling stress is because a lot of carriers, if you isolate the auto line, have been running 125% combined ratios. So they're losing 25 cents on every dollar. And when something like that happens, insurance companies have three tools they can really use, right? And I think this is where you're driving at, and I want to tie it with a bow at the end here. So when insurance companies are experiencing a lack of profitability, and like it or not, they are for-profit entities. So if you have an issue with them being for-profit entities, that's a moral and like systemic issue. But currently, right, they are
mm-hmm.
for-profit entities. So they're going to operate that way. So they have three tools they can use. They can either A, raise prices. And we see this all the time, right? Now, they can't just raise prices ad hoc. There are regulations nationally and by state. So Arizona is a use and file state, meaning you have to file something with the Department of Insurance. It has to be approved. And then once it's approved by the Department of Insurance, you can use it. So quick sidebar, if you look at the struggling California insurance market, right, the reason for that primarily is there has not been a rate refile approved in that state since 2018, which means you're asking insurance carriers to sell policies for 2025 exposures at 2018 rates. If you run a business right now, imagine if someone was legally compelling you to charge your customers your 2018 price in 2025. How incentivized would you be to operate in that arena? Pretty low incentivization, right? So they can raise prices, but it's not an ad hoc. They can't just do whatever they want. If they get the filed rate increase, they will raise the prices per their actuarial algorithms. The next thing that they can do is they can say, okay, our terms and conditions, what's in the policy, the legalese, maybe we're overexposed by giving too much away in the legalese. So we need to change the legalese so that we're not overexposed. So they can do that. They can change T&C. Conversely, if they wanted to be more competitive in a marketplace, they could make the legalese better, more advantageous to the customer to try to gain market share. So they do it both ways, right? And then finally, they can say, okay, certain industries are causing us a lot of exposure. So on cybercrime, right? Maybe we're not going to write accountants anymore because accountants pay bills for other people, right? So there's certainly things where they say, okay, we're really getting killed in an industry vertical or two. That doesn't mean we don't want to write cyber anymore, and we don't want to raise our price because we feel like our price is good for 80 or 90% of our customer base. But the 10% of our customer base that is killing us on losses, we can't afford to let them access this product at this price anymore. It's just not going to sustain.
So I've seen a lot of insurance renewals for cyber starting to
Yep.
push and require tooling and attestation around tooling and attestation around,
Yeah.
program. So
Yep.
how does that factor into all this?
Yeah. Yeah. So cyber liability, relatively young product in the market. Depending on who you ask, it was 98 or 99 that the first product came out, the real product that we see today. There was a electronic data compromise, an EDC product that came out in the early 90s, late 80s, but that is a different product. So anyway, being such a young product, for a long time, it functioned in a very artificial marketplace. There was no underwriting, not because they didn't want to, because they didn't have any data to even set up any meaningful underwriting. So
Mm-hmm.
you had this process of essentially, are you a company? Do you draw breath or have a pulse? Here's a cyber liability policy for $1,500.
Right.
And some of that was them trying to gain enough market share to get real data to
Mm-hmm.
create real underwriting. That takes time, right? It's not something that can happen overnight. So between the time lapse component, and then of course we had a massive event in 2020 that caused a massive shift towards work from home that many companies were not ready
Mm-hmm.
for from a cybersecurity or IT perspective.
Yeah,
Caused
absolutely.
a massive influx of breach events and ransomware events and anything you can think of, right? That also was kind of a catalyst for enhanced underwriting. When we first came out of COVID, a couple years later, that enhanced underwriting, the questions were written as if they were sophisticated, but the people that were reviewing the questions didn't really know what they were asking. So there was a lot of frustration for a good 12, 18-month period where you would have people fill out applications and then get really ridiculous questions. So I'll give you a great example. One of my clients is FedRAMP certified.
Okay, big deal.
Yes. So FedRAMP is, like 100 more controls than SOC 2, right?
Right.
That as a compliance framework is pretty intense, right? So we send in this application. It says we're FedRAMP certified. We get a question back from an underwriter. Do they use MFA? We're like, they're FedRAMP.
Yes. Yes, they used MFA.
Yes, and many other things, right? They are safer than
T-
most companies out there,
Tell me you
right?
don't know what you're talking about without telling me you don't know what you're talking about, right?
Exactly. So this was very much a friction point for a period of time because you had these applications that were getting lengthier, and it's not as if the questions were unfair. They were fair questions in many contexts, but the people that were underwriting them were not as educated as they should have been, right? So you had frustrated customers, you had frustrated folks like yourself in the IT brokerage space or the MSP or MSSP space. I feel like we're finally getting to a point where there's enough expertise on the insurance underwriting side that they actually understand a little bit
Mm-hmm.
what they're asking now.
Yep.
Uh, now, to your point, they're wanting controls potentially, depending on the carrier, they're wanting attestations, and those attestations are usually specific to tools. They're not, holistic or enterprise or anything like that. Yes, there are controls that they're looking for people to have. That is something where I think if you looked at those controls and you looked at attack vectors today, they're usually a pretty good heat map that overlaps, right? They're sensitive to the issues that are causing a lot of the problems, and they're hoping that you have some basic controls to stave off those problems. Now they'll be flexible based on what is realistic for an entity of your size, right? So, example, if you're an organization under 10 employees, in many cases, having Defender would be considered a firewall for an
Mm-hmm.
organization under 10 employees because they get it. You're not going to go out and get a next gen firewall with
Mm-hmm.
4 people, right? Like that's just not a cost you're going to incur. So there is some realistic flexibility at this point based on size of organization. As far as attestations, that's relatively limited right now. There are carriers that use those. Those, they become a point of contention in the sense that they can be used punitively, and there's one landmark case where they were used punitively, and that's the only one to exist still, and that was years ago, 3 years ago, I think. At this point, that was a 150 or so manufacturing company in the Midwest. They had attested to travelers that they had MFA deployed. They did
Mm-hmm.
not. The breach was the result of lack of MFA, and the claim was ultimately denied, and that was upheld by a court in their local jurisdiction.
Well,
But
so
that's
this,
the
I mean, but
yeah,
that creates, right, that becomes another risk vector for a company, which is, oh, we think we've got a secure email gateway in place, but it turned out we didn't turn it on,
yeah,
or
yep, yep,
we we removed configuration, or there was misconfiguration, or
yeah,
we're doing security awareness training but we weren't, or we were doing this but we weren't, like we
yeah.
have
So
MFA for everything but these 10 accounts, and one of those 10 accounts got exploited, right? Like,
let me tie it back to how the policy functions, right? So within any policy, and this is not specific to cyber liability, this is any liability policy that exists. There's a statement in there. It'll be called a representations clause or a warranties clause. Different companies call it different things, but it's one of those two things, right? Essentially, that's a statement in the policy legalese that says we as the insurance carrier received information from you and your representative, so your broker, and we took that information to generate your policy terms and conditions, the limits that we offered you, the deductibles we offered you, the price that we offered you, all these things. In the event that we find out, whether it be at time of loss or not at time of loss, that some of those things may have been untrue, here's how we're going to react. So to me, when we're talking about cyber liability specifically, having awareness of your representations or warranty clause and how advantageous they are to the customer versus how non-advantageous they are to the customer is very important when you're buying that insurance right now. And then know that when you're signing an attestation, the way that works, so there's a little form you sign, right? That attestation gets built into the policy right next to the representation and warranties clause.
mm-hmm.
That's where that goes. So in the event that you're not signing any of them, you're just dealing with that clause as is. But in the event that you sign an attestation, that's where it morphs into the policy. It gets seated right next to that reps and warranties clause. So I'll give you a couple of examples, and you can see quickly the spectrum of these reps and warranties clauses. So to me, there's a provider out there that I would consider on a podium type arrangement, the gold provider. And their reps and warranties clause is actually called innocent non-disclosure. And it's one sentence, and it says, unless we can prove that the non-disclosure or misinformation was reckless or deliberate on your part,
Mm-hmm.
and you knew that it would harm us, we cannot seek to deny your claim.
Right. So you're proving fraud basically as the standard for okay.
That is very advantageous to the customer because the examples you just described of we thought we had an email monitoring tool turned on and
Right.
we didn't. That may not have been reckless or deliberate. You may have genuinely thought that.
Right.
You may have an email from your outside IT. Yep, it's turned on. And who are you as the COO of a manufacturing company to disagree with your IT guy as to whether or not the email filtering is turned on, right?
Right. Right.
So that to me is very advantageous, A, because it leans customer, but B, it leans customer in such a broad and vague way that it remains advantageous in the dynamic environment of cyber risk, where you're going to be changing tools, where vectors are going to change of attack. It doesn't pin you down to certain things. It basically just says, unless it was you being really reckless and deliberate and lying to us on purpose to try to compel us to pay a claim that we otherwise shouldn't have paid, we cannot even seek to deny your claim. We just pay your claim. That is fantastic. Conversely, there are reps and warranties clauses that exist that will say something to the effect of, in the event that it was you or your broker or any other party we talked to at any time that was representing you or had agency for you, and it was not reckless or deliberate, but it still remains untrue, we can void your policy ab initio, so at its inception. We'll return the premium to you, but we owe you none of the duties under this policy. So I tell you that to tie this all up in a bow, like I told you I would. There's a lot of fear-mongering around insurance companies and whether or not they're going to pay claims and legalese and all these different things. An insurance policy is a contract. It is not weird for insurance carriers to have contracts. Every business industry uses contracts. That is such a weird thing to try to scapegoat insurance for, right? Like, oh, they had a contract and they used the verbiage of the contract, right? Like everyone does that. The bow I'm putting on this here is when you're looking at a quote or a set of quotes, and one quote is $1,700 and another quote is $3,500. The reason for that may be that the $1,700 quote has the reps and warranties clause that allows them to void your policy ab initio at the drop of a hat.
Mm-hmm.
The $3,400 or $3,500 quote may have the innocent non-disclosure clause. Premium, while not a perfect system, is the tangible representation of the risk that the carrier thinks that they're sharing with you. So if the premium is very low, that's them communicating that the contract is going to say they share very little risk with you.
Right.
Right? And
Right.
if the premium is high, that's them communicating, we feel like we're sharing a pretty good amount of risk with you.
Mm-hmm.
And then again, I think it's a little bit interesting, all for-profit business models, if we said, okay, we're going to loan you $1 million or potentially loan you $1 million, and we'd like $5,000 as interest on that potential loan that we may have to give you per a set of terms and conditions. Any small private business owner would consider that $5,000 of interest to be fair on $1 million potential loan.
Right.
That's what insurance is.
Right.
Right.
So in this case, subsidiary, not technical, didn't have it.
Yep.
Parent, technical or perceived technical enough, right?
Yep.
Where they had it. In this case, they had CNC machines with OT, and there's a bunch of other stuff, and understanding like the damage that would actually do, put them in a position where they ended up with this policy. And to your example, fortunately, the subsidiary ends up being covered by the parent because of the relationship. From I guess from like breach to discovery to okay, we actually have coverage. How much time has lapsed for this business?
We're inside of 90 days.
Mm-hmm.
Through the whole process between the time it happened, the FI doing their investigation and potentially, trying to claw back money, of course, unsuccessful in this case, all the way to talking to us, going through our order of operations, filing claims, all that good stuff. We're inside of 90 days.
Okay. And then on that, so we'll be very like specific here. So on that $64,000 loss, mm-hmm. How much was covered?
So they had a limit on the parent policy of $250,000, mm-hmm. subject to a deductible of $10,000. So they pay the $10,000 and the remainder is covered. So yes, they still technically are out $10,000, but they're not
a lot
out
less than 64. Yeah.
Yeah.
What kind of, now this one is relatively straightforward. We compromised your email. We tricked somebody into sending money to a place they shouldn't have sent money. Money went out the door. What kind of post-event investigation and remediation was pushed onto this company? I mean, did insurance come and say, hey, we want, incident response, we want forensics, we want an evaluation? Did they not? What actually happened here?
Sure. So the IT provider that they used performed forensic IT to the best of their ability at the early stages. And at that time, insurance, no claim had been filed. So mm-hmm. Insurance is not going to send anything out. But yes, if you're asking how the insurance is going to function, the answer is when an insurance company is made aware that there's a cyber breach and there's a cyber liability policy, they will absolutely want forensic IT to be part of that. And that is part of your contract. Just like many other liability policy types, they have kind of copied, an idea that is not novel in insurance, but now placed it onto cyber liability policies. So I'll give an example. The EEOC, right? The Equal Employment Opportunities Commission, that's existed for a long time. There's been a policy that you can buy to protect your entity called employment practices liability for a long time. When you buy an EPLI policy, because that's an old coverage, an established coverage, you get generally, through most of the reputable providers, access to a national or regional EPLI specialist law firm
Mm-hmm.
that will either give you an amount of time for free or unlimited amount of time. And the reason for that is it's cheaper for the insurance company to pay a national law firm on a retainer and not pay claims when they shouldn't have to pay claims than it is to just pay nuisance claims, right?
Right.
So it's a value-added service in the vested interest to protect the client, but also to not pay claims if there's not fault or liability on behalf of the client. So same thing here. With breach events being so common now, and with figuring out what happened, when it happened, how it happened, who did it, all these things being very prescient to whether or not the insurance company should or should not pay that claim, and
Mm-hmm.
whether or not there is or is not liability on behalf of the client, right?
Right.
They have retained forensic IT firms regionally or nationally based on the carrier, and that's who they use as a master service provider to come out and do that forensic IT as part of claim response. Yeah.
Now, money going out the door, different investigation, different remediation, right? Like this is email was compromised. How was it
Yep.
compromised? How do we resolve the compromise? Are there changes that we need to put in place to prevent this type of compromise in the future? Which is, look, right? People will say it's technology, but I'm sure there's a decent amount of process and training and people things that changed as well as a result of this. I don't know how much of that you can talk about, but if we shifted gears and dip our toes into ransomware, right? The whole
Sure.
incident response and forensics changes a little bit, right? Because now you're talking about like a completely different can of worms, right?
Yeah. So I have a different client that I can give you a high level overview of a story on with the ransomware, and it was an amazing story in how successful they were in not paying the ransomware and how fast they were back up and operating. This is also a local Phoenix company. Gross revenues 35 million annually. They're a thin client, zero client manufacturer.
Oh, good for them. Good for them.
Yeah.
Probably made a big difference in their recovery. Yeah.
Yeah. So they manufacture thin clients, zero clients. They do custom operating systems, whether it's Mac OS, Linux, Windows, whatever it may be. So it was President's Day, I believe 3 years ago now. They had a skeleton crew in the office.
Always.
It's a holiday, right? And holidays are pretty infamous attack days.
Again, professionals, they
Yep.
know what they're doing, and
They do.
and it's tested, right?
Yep.
There's an iterative process to exert maximum pain and leverage on you. Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. They know that the director of IT is probably on a boat somewhere in Cabo, right? He's not there for President's Day. All this good stuff. So the dreaded power cycling starts. Right,
no.
on all the units, and pops the message, pay us such and such amount. The initial ask was 800,000, and
and by the way, just as a little aside, by the time this ransom is launched, they usually understand how much revenue you have and are sizing the demand based on what's the maximum likely payment they can get out of you based on pain they can exert. Like going to a $30 million company and say, we want 800 grand. I mean, they're not asking for $30 million. You have the ability to write a check for 800 grand, probably, right? Like they're not asking for 60 grand.
Yeah. So they're very much to the point of, if they can, breach wherever they breach and then move vertically or horizontally over to like a CFO's computer, and they can pull up a P&L or a balance sheet or something that shows cash on hand, suspiciously, the ask looks very similar to cash on hand, right? if you put those two numbers together, they're a very similar number. Sometimes the same number.
So strange.
Yeah, weird, right? So, this company, thankfully, has excellent cybersecurity practices internally.
Mm-hmm.
They have a strong relationship with a local MSP that does a good job. And they have a strong relationship with us, and they have a very good cyber liability insurance policy. So between all of the minds, right, between all the efforts they've made pre-ransomware, and all the efforts made by all the parties to help them with forensic IT, to evict, to utilize their backups, so on and so forth, they had fully evicted and not paid the ransomware and were back up and running inside of 72 hours.
It's such a phenomenal example of why a little, like, an ounce of prevention is just worth so much here, right? Because having basic things in place, like proper backups, immutable backups, the ability to source, I was having this conversation the other day, and it's like, a breach is going to happen. Statistically, it's just going to happen. The difference is whether or not you can identify it, how long it takes to identify, and can you clearly identify when and why and how
Mm-hmm.
far back you have to go to be safe, right? And being able to say, hey, look, we know the breach took place at 7:42 p.m. on last Thursday, and let's just go back to the backup on Wednesday, and we're not recovering, like it's such a huge difference for an organization.
So I was on a podcast just earlier this month with some folks from Iron Mountain, and we were talking about the same claim example with the same client. And while they had triple redundancy on backups, including immutable, that's fantastic. But one of the things that we felt set this particular client apart in this instance was they didn't just have the backups; they regularly tested the accessibility and viability of the backups.
Such a big deal. Such
Right?
a big deal.
Like,
Such a basic thing. It's not, does the backup actually work?
yes, yes. So you hear a lot of people get really fluffy and really excited because they have double redundancy or triple redundancy, and they've got this in the cloud or whatever, but they haven't tested the viability or accessibility of that backup in 3 years.
Oh. And by the way, it's not even does the backup work or does the data work. It's like, how long does it take you to pull the data back down from wherever you put it to recover it, right? You're like,
Yes,
oh, you've got this small pipe and you got to pull down, X amount of terabytes of data, okay, great. That recovery is going to take you, 4 days in download, like now
yes,
what, like,
yep. And in our conversation, the next point we made was this is a great use case for 5G. Because if you had access to 5G and you had 3 terabytes of data, the speed at which you can recover is very different than
well,
4G.
yeah, in my case, in my world, I tell everybody, if you don't have 10 gig to your office, like, what are you doing at this point? Like,
Sure.
it's now, like, okay, I get it. Not everybody wants to write that check, but it's not that expensive. So, like, it's a very, you know, I mean, the price to put 10 gig in somebody's office at this point is what a T1 cost when I was starting, in IT. Like,
Mhm.
let's be real here. Your people were paying, for 1.5 meg, what you could get 10 gig at this point for now. So, like, anyways, I don't want
And
to
the point
tangent
you
too
just
much
made,
there.
though, is so important to both of our industries and many industries that work in trying to help businesses prevent, prepare, all
Mm-hmm.
these things, right? Take risk off the balance sheet, so on and so forth. Is that many private businesses can afford the cost of 10 gig to the office. It's extra per month, but you can't
Mm-hmm.
afford it. Many private businesses can't afford a cyber liability policy. Is it a little extra per month? Yes, it is. Do you know what most private or small enterprises can afford? $800,000 in ransomware.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Many private small enterprises have a little extra money per month to speak to prevention, to speak to protection, all these different things. They don't have boatloads of cash to survive a disaster
Just so
recovery
many
type event.
people are still like in this mindset of like, I'm not a target. It's not going to happen to me. I'm not at risk. I'm not interesting. I'm not a bank. I'm not a defense
Security by
contractor.
obscurity.
Hmm? Yeah. I mean,
Security
but
by
like,
obscurity. Yeah.
um, and it's hard. It's hard to it's hard to convince like talk somebody out of like a belief that just isn't grounded in any sort of truth or reality, right? Like, you're like, the world is flat. And you're like, no, it's not. It's round, and like, well, no, it's flat, and like, I'm not a target, like, how do you help somebody like get over that line of like, no, you've got a computer. Like, sorry, like, this is just it.
Yeah, I mean, there's a certain amount of people that you're just not going to help, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no amount of talking or creative thinking that you could apply that's going to bring them over that fence. But I think the best thing that you can do for those people that potentially could be helped is help them, understand and consider risks that they may not have otherwise considered. So I'll give you an example. One of my largest clients is a landscaping company, and they technically call themselves vegetation management because they do right of way clearance for the largest power company here in Arizona. So essentially, they go out to all the land in the state of Arizona that is owned by that very large power company,
Mm-hmm.
and they make sure that all of their equipment is not exposed to overgrown vegetation.
Right. So immediately, like, number one concern for insurance is workers' comp and injury, right?
You're thinking, the classic big three, right?
Right.
General
Right.
liability, auto, work comp,
Of
right?
course.
But here's where I'm going with this. They have a fleet that's approaching 100 vehicles. And in that fleet, inside of every truck, they have a tablet for each employee.
Dispatch, job notes, ER,
All of the
CRM
stuff.
action, like all the stuff. Yep.
Checking off that you put your PPE on, that you did your vehicle
Mm-hmm.
inspection, all the goodies, right?
Yep.
If they're going to remote and rural places in Arizona to do right-of-way clearance on vegetation on behalf of a power company, whose network are they on using that tablet?
I mean, it depends. That's interesting, right? I guess it depends. Cellular is not available everywhere, so it's probably not exclusively cellular access, right? Then you
So
get into
all
the
of a
power
sudden,
company. Is the power company's network, and probably in a lot of places, people don't realize this, but power companies run fiber along their utility poles and run their own networks to their stations in the middle of nowhere, so they have access to it. Yeah.
yep. So here you are on a company issued tablet.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. Yeah.
And yeah, I put my goggles on, and yep, I made sure I held the chainsaw the right way, and you're filling out your report or whatever. And it's at that point that a bad actor uses your tablet as the vector to get to a major utility company.
Whoops.
And in that case, right, with this particular client, when we phrased it that way, when we said, "Hey, you could very well be an access point to a major utility company by way of those company issued tablets," they bought a large cyber liability policy. They got it.
Yeah. They probably
Right?
also invested in a reasonable amount of cyber, tooling, process, people, protection, everything else as well with it. I mean, this is not theoretical though, right? Like,
It's not at all.
Target, biggest example, like one of the first ones, Target had had key loggers and stuff running on their point of sales terminals, and that was their HVAC contractor, right? Like, it's
100%.
you know,
Running a Bluetooth diagnostic device on a rooftop AC
yeah.
unit, and it was an unsecured, unprotected Bluetooth diagnostic device, and that's how they got in, right? So the other thing too is, in the scope of what we do, the revenues for this company, while they work for other entities, 80% of their company revenues are tied to that contract. Without that contract, they don't exist,
Right.
or they don't exist in the way that they exist today, right? Even if they do persevere. It's incumbent upon us as people that are trying to counsel them and offer them protection to help them realize, hey, you have that exposure to that power company. If you don't protect that exposure, you're not protecting 80% of your revenue.
Well, and that's not even like exposure in terms of like, oh, you're responsible for whatever happens, like financially, but realistically, your contract is null and void at that point with them, and
If you can't make them whole, right? If
you're laying everybody off, right?
Yeah, they are not going to entertain a negotiation on whether or not they continue your services if you don't have the opportunity to make them whole. The only way you have an opportunity even to attempt to preserve that contract at time of loss is to say, don't worry, we have a policy, it's going to make you whole, right? And then maybe you persevere. But if you leave them holding a $3 million bag or a $5 million bag, they're calling somebody else.
So we were talking about incident response briefly. Every is too much. Almost every major MDR vendor, MSSP in the market is offering some version of an incident response, right? And it's usually a relatively small retainer. They tax onto it. So, less than 5% of the overall MDR cost would be an IR retainer. of course, if you have a lot of, a lot of endpoints and a big MDR, the incident response retainer might be a blip on the radar for you. And one thing that's nice about having that in play, right, is the company is then a little bit more predetermined on who they're going to be at the table with, right? Like we've had an issue, like we're using our vendor that we've selected with our run books, we've already developed, and we have this sort of thing, as opposed to calling the insurance company, and the insurance company is saying, like, we're going to bring in X, Y, and Z that you've never met or talked to before. They're going to be there tomorrow, like with their laptops, like open your doors up, and like, this might feel uncomfortable for you, right? How is that evolving now with insurance companies in terms of, third party IR, what you need to do in place, advantages, disadvantages, whatnot?
Yeah. So the overarching perspective of any vendors that insurance companies are going to choose and provide to you,
Mm-hmm.
and or within this the policy language say you can choose your own, and we will pay their costs as a result of accepting the claim. The overarching perspective has just been, please make sure they're a specialist, right? So if you have a breach event, don't hire your nephew who took one computer class at Mesa Community College, right? Right. Please hire an expert, a specialist.
Well, this is a big frustration I have, because there's, basically every MSP and telco and whatever company is trying to get in the space and say, hey, we're security experts now. And I'm like, well, let's go talk about what your MSP actually is. And you're like, oh, they've got 12 engineers and they do IT desktop support for us and install our printers. And you're like, I'm sure they're really good at that. I mean, no, but how do they have, experience and education and skill set to actually do your security here? It's different.
Yeah, that sounds more like break fix, right? The evolution in terms of maybe you do have an outside relationship that has more familiarity with you, that you've maybe done disaster recovery training exercises with, or built a disaster recovery plan with, all of these things that would be presumably helpful at time of loss, right? Again, as long as they're an expert, insurance companies are pretty open-minded. But within the providers that they're giving to you, so they'll say, hey, we have XYZ provider that we use in the Southwest region, or that we use nationally, or whatever it may be. They're trying to allow you to start developing a relationship with them by including some of those other services as part of the policy premium, right? So they'll say, hey, this is the forensic IT or breach response firm that we use, but they also do security awareness training.
Mm-hmm.
They also can help you build out a disaster recovery plan.
Mm-hmm.
These are all things that will be given to you either fully subsidized, so at no additional cost to you outside of the policy premium, or significantly subsidized. So if it's $1,000 on the open market, it'll be $200 for you as a policyholder. So it's 80% off, right? And hopefully, if you're using that, if you don't have your own relationship already, now you're starting to build that relationship, and you're gaining value, right? You're gaining value of putting your people through security awareness training. You're gaining value of having a disaster recovery plan where you may not have otherwise had one. But you've also started to build a relationship with that firm in case you ever actually have to interact with them.
I want to talk about this term, fiduciary responsibility, right?
Sure.
And I spent most of my life in Southern California, which means that every year, for every organization I've ever been involved with, there was this conversation around DR. And it was related to the potential 10.0 earthquake and California turning into like an island and all these different things, right?
Yep.
And at the beginning of my career was really frustrating for me, because you'd spend a lot of time, a lot of energy, produce a plan, come up with budgets, identify vendors, go through this whole thing and deliver this report, to the executive team, and that would go and get wrapped up and then go to the board, and the board would read it and say, oh, this looks great. Thank you very much. We've decided not to do it. And it was very frustrating, very frustrating, until at some point I realized that the whole point of the exercise was to, provide the board with enough information that they could then make a judgment and do their fiduciary responsibility of the company, which was, okay, we've evaluated this DR plan, and we've determined that it doesn't make sense because the cost of, or the expense of it versus the likelihood of the risk or the event is not warranted. So thank you very much for doing the report, but we're not going to move forward with it, right? And that was a big unlock for me, like mentally, because then I understood what I was actually working towards, not that I was like actually getting this DR site, turned up, right?
Right.
Um, how is that evolving with cybersecurity and insurance and fiduciary responsibilities now? Because I'm reading a lot of things. It's like, are we going to see personal transference of liability, right, onto an executive team or onto a board for some of this stuff?
So we haven't yet, and it's funny that you asked me that question because I actually wrote an article about this on LinkedIn. This is in my article was specific to the duty of care, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as a board member, you have certain duties that you owe to that entity that you serve on the board for, and specifically the duty of care is the one that's being attacked right now. So there's no successful case where that veil to transfer the risk onto the board has occurred yet, right? It has not been pierced yet, but there is certainly attempts in many jurisdictions to do just that. So essentially, the vector is this by those legal professionals is you're a member of a board. You have enough information and oversight of an entity to reasonably establish that there is a cyber risk and that you should have a cyber liability policy and that you should have outside IT and that you get X amount of budget to that outside IT and have such and such tools based on your size and scope. And based on your size and scope, you should have X amount of limit and terms and conditions and so on and so forth. So in the event that you didn't do either of those things at all, so you didn't engage IT or you didn't buy a cyber liability policy at all, and or you engaged IT and you bought a policy, but you should have bought a $5 million policy and you bought a $1 million policy, and you should have had a $150,000 IT budget and you had a $35,000 IT budget.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the cases we're seeing right now. And at some point, that domino will fall, right?
How much of this is just like I don't want to say like an ignorance defense, but being able to say like I had no reasonable expectation that I knew this information because of XYZ, so therefore the duty of care is limited, versus saying, at this point, 2025, we've had so many breaches and there's so much events that you can't pretend like you didn't know that MFA was important, or you can't pretend that you didn't know you needed a cyber insurance, right?
Yeah, that's where it's starting to get unreasonable, and that's why you're seeing so much heat in this area of tort right now, because of the fact that many people now accept or acknowledge that cyber is enterprise risk, and if it's enterprise risk, you can't say I shouldn't have reasonably been aware, right? So now you're talking about duty of care. Now you're talking about having to be engaged on these items, and I am confident that domino is going to tip inside of the next 3 years.
Don't be that use case.
Yeah.
I mean, you do not want to set this case law. Do not be the precedent here. Like
that's going to be an unfortunate company. Whoever that is, they're not going to be feeling good about it.
Okay, I might come back to this in a second, but going back to the original example here, insurance, forensics happens, identify breach, remediation hopefully has occurred, insurance, minus deductible pays out. What's the follow-on for them for this? I don't want to say like from like a lessons learned, but like what changed as a result of it? I mean, I have assumptions. I'm really curious to hear the answer though.
Yeah. So, in the notion of cybercrime specifically, right? In this case, the manipulated invoice. Typically, with good cyber insurance carriers, and that was the case here, there was a security awareness training that was offered to the whole staff, and that was not at cost. That was within the cost of the premium. But beyond that, the risk control measures that they undertook were additional verification prior to sending payment. Right? So
process.
Yes.
Involving people.
Yeah, process and people. So typically, when things are going good and people are feeling comfortable, you see an invoice that seems reasonable, seems like a regular source, and you don't go another step to verify. You just hit pay, right? You hit the green button that's lit up. So now what they've done is, they've engaged a secondary verification And that secondary verification is at first a phone call to an individual at the material supplier that has ability to, send an invoice of that
Right.
amount. And then after the phone call, they have that person who they just spoke to on the phone sign and return a document with that invoice amount on it, that
Right.
date, so on and so forth. So it's process and people.
Did they end up changing tools?
To my knowledge, they haven't yet changed tools.
Mm-hmm.
Not that they necessarily don't believe that they shouldn't consider that, but they haven't pressed go on changing tools yet, to my knowledge.
Right. Impersonation prevention, relatively standard feature for most of the major email gateways. Big complication, especially for the smaller businesses, is it requires you to be on an enterprise license of your collaboration suite, right? So I feel like, especially in the smaller seat count businesses, they don't want to go there just yet because of the cost. So I get that. If you're, especially, again, if you're manufacturing, you got a lot of people on the floor, not a lot of people in email. Do you really want to go there? But
Sure.
I would imagine that they probably have changed their insurance policies somewhat as a result of this.
So, in this case, we always take a look at, okay, you had an event for $64,000. You currently have a limit that would apply to that event of $250,000.
Mm-hmm.
We always want to make sure, is the 250 enough, right? So 64, well inside of 250, we're okay on this particular anecdote, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But do you send money in excess of 250? If so, how often?
Right.
And in some cases, they never do, right? Hey, the biggest payment we've sent in the last 24 months was $102,000. Cool, 250 is going to be just fine. But in some cases, they say, hey, once a quarter, we send a payment for $1 million. Well, oh shit, 250.
Yeah. Do you want to?
Right?
Well, but that's also a very specific, risk profile and mitigation for cybercrime of invoice fraud, of payment fraud. But there's also ransomware, right? Like,
Yep.
do you now evaluate? Do you have proper backups? Do you now evaluate? Do you have a proper system to detect breaches? And find source of breach? Do you have run books to deal with that? Like, ransomware is a different profile for you than like, oh, did we send a payment to the wrong place?
It is. I think whenever an event occurs, there's certainly a period of time, and it'll be shorter or longer depending on the client and the severity of the incident, but there's certainly a period of time when there's a heightened sensitivity, right? For most people, at least the next 30 days, there's a heightened sensitivity. Depending on the severity of the event, it could be longer than that. During that period of heightened sensitivity, you definitely see more engagement with all the people that hopefully they would have been engaged with more often prior to the event, right? So we start to get a lot more engagement. All of a sudden, there's a lot of questions about their policy that they never had before, right? All of a sudden, there's a lot of questions about limits for things like ransomware that are another profile, or lost business income, so on and so forth. You also see a lot more questions towards folks like yourselves or towards their MSP or MSSP if they have one, or if they've got some limited break fix man hours, but their IT provider can be an MSP. All of a sudden, they're reconsidering that contract, or they're reconsidering a new software stack, or whatever it may be. So yes, you see a heightened sensitivity and a lot more engagement for a period of time, and you're just hopeful that that's meaningful, that they take something away from it.
Joe, what's something that you wish business owners, executives, board members, what's something you wish people in these positions understood or thought about more as it relates? I mean, we could say cybersecurity, but let's just really call it cybercrime, like how they protect themselves from cybercrime.
Yeah, I wish that there was more of an awareness towards the frequency and the reality that it is. I wish that there was more of a desire to be educated, not only on your own, but to trust those sources that can help you with their expertise. uh, I feel like, for both of our industries, cybersecurity and for insurance, there's definitely a tendency by a good chunk of buyers to view us as vendors, to view us as order takers,
Mm-hmm.
and not to view us as consultants with a level of expertise in a important industry. Um, so, if anything, I would encourage people to um, reframe how they position their relationship with their cybersecurity professional and their insurance professional.
Yeah. I mean, because quite seriously, we're trying to keep you in business. I mean, I have this really weird view of, I mean, when I say weird, I think when we got to it, I view my job for for a long time now as making people's lives better. Now we happen to use technology in order to effectuate that outcome, and I also will express it as I'm here to help companies grow and scale. And why is that, right? When companies grow and scale, they hire more people. People have better outcomes, lives. Families are impacted. I've been on the other side of it. I've been I've been inside of organizations. I went through .com days, right? Like you don't want to be on the receiving end of a layoff. You want to have anything to do with it. You don't have to be on the side that's like doing the layoffs. You don't want to be on the side that's receiving the layoff. It's terrible, right? So, but I look at the same way with cybercrime and cybersecurity. It's like you do not want to walk into your office one day and have your screen reset and see ransomware. Like it's just not a good place to be.
I have a similar perspective. I started my career at a very large firm, a top five publicly traded global firm, 30,000 employees, multi billion dollar enterprise. And while I very much realize I like this industry quite a bit, their mission, in serving top 100, top 150 companies just didn't suffice what I wanted to do. So I'm at a local firm now because for me, I view my job as community impact. If I can give good consultation and good advisement and good insurance products to my local small and medium business owners that help protect them when they need it most and help indemnify them when they need it most and keep their business solvent and operating at their lowest possible time, I'm impacting my community, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like to me, it's community impact. That is 100% how I view my job.
I find a lot of cybersecurity is externally driven for companies, right? They end up going through a compliance framework, which is usually a supply chain requirement. They want to do business with some other organization, or they fit with whatever industry, so therefore they have to adhere to a a compliance framework, which then requires certain cybersecurity activity. I've seen it driven from insurance. Oh, we need insurance because of the usually also again because of some requirement, so we have to have certain things in order to get insurance. And so I'm finding that's pushing the needle forward. But what I haven't really seen yet, and I don't know where really the like inflection point happens. I'm curious, what your thoughts are on this, of like people actually just understanding that we have to have this. Like you lock the front door on your house, not because necessarily you've been burglarized in the past, but just because you have to lock the front door on the house. And at what point do we get to a position where people just understand, like, you just have to have this stuff?
Yeah, so very interesting, thread there. When you look at insurance as a concept, right? It's a risk pooling concept. So you may not need access to this insurance product and this insurance limit at this time, but you may in the future. So we all pay in premiums together. This creates a pool of money, and hopefully, at the time you need to pull from that pool of money, your policy terms and conditions supports you being able to pull at that time, right? So when we look at what compels people to buy insurance products, there's kind of three tiers. The most common tier, the bottom part of the pyramid that's very large right now, is legal compliance. So the state of Arizona says you must have a policy. The registrar of contractors says you must have a policy. By statute, you buy that policy. That's the biggest tranche of buyers. as you go up the pyramid, the next tranche of buyers is contractual solvency. So B2B, private enterprise to private enterprise, you have to meet a compliance framework. You need to have such and such insurance. So you buy a tool, you buy a policy, not because you're particularly interested in it or care what it does, other than the fact that it unlocks that contract and allows you to generate that revenue.
Yep.
Right?
Yep. I see that every day. Sure.
Yeah. Yep. And then finally, you get to that smaller portion of the pyramid. And that is the people that say, okay, we've done steps 1 and 2. And we're not going to pat ourselves on the back yet, because honestly, those are the things that every company should do: be contractually solvent and be legally compliant. Now we're going to say, okay, based on the operations that we undertake, right? We do incur risk naturally. Not that we're out there looking for it. We certainly try to manage that risk. We certainly try to, avoid risk where we can avoid risk. But in the event that we can't manage it, or managing it doesn't allay it altogether and we can't avoid it, we're naturally incurring some risk. And that risk could be to the company's balance sheet. That risk could be to the company's employees. That risk could be to those vendors or services or consultants that you work with. That risk could be to your community, to your neighbors in your strip center, or whatever it may be. What can we do reasonably within the company's affordability to say, let's consider other products and services besides legal compliance and contractual compliance to protect ourselves, to protect our employees, to protect our vendors, to protect our neighbors, all these different things. So when you think about what insurance concept is conceptually as a risk pool, the fact that that top part of the pyramid is the smaller portion is also part of the reason that insurance premiums continue to rise, because there's not enough people paying in, but lots of people that want to take out. Right? So if we could flip that pyramid, and the largest part of the pyramid was the people that did all 3 of those things, and the smallest part of the pyramid was the people who just wanted to be legally compliant, it would probably have a pretty good impact on insurance premiums.
This also, opens up like another vein. Insurance is a for-profit business, right? So at what point do we start seeing insurance companies that are really looking and doing deeper risk assessments, for insurance, and saying, hey, we've done a relatively thorough evaluation of you, and as a result, you're relatively low risk, and so therefore we're going to give you a really good insurance product at a very low premium because we don't perceive a lot of risk here. I would imagine the same thing in like general liability or whatever theft. It's like, we've got a fire system, a fire alarm, a security guard, at this, at that, or the next thing. You cross over a certain number of boxes and your premium goes way down. Like if you're in a brick building with fire suppression and 24/7, people on site, versus if you've got, a 2x4 construction building in the middle of the wilderness with with nothing, right? Like different risk profile, right?
Yep, and much of that is already encapsulated within underwriting, within actuarial algorithms, whether that's conspicuous or not conspicuous to the general consumer. So to give you an easy example, if you've ever had a policy on a building, a property policy, there's something called PC class or protection class. So that's a 1 through 10 scale, and that is literally a scale that iterates your distance to emergency services. Most notably, as it relates to protecting a building, a fire department, right? So if you are a brick building and you have a sprinkler system and you're also PC class 1, so there's a fire department across the street, very unlikely that you have a fire total loss.
Right.
But if you are a frame 2x4 building that is 45 minutes from a fire department that is private service only that you have to enroll to, right? If you have a fire, you're probably going to burn all the way down, even if they leave as soon as they can possibly leave, and even if you subscribe to that private provider.
How sophisticated is insurance underwriting with cybersecurity at this point? Because there's a tool question and then there's a process, and people question, right? So going and saying, you've got this tool versus that tool versus this other tool. Like when we do, tool evaluation, fundamentally, right? It's like, I can tell you that like you might think that this is a good tool, but it's actually complete junk garbage, and you really should get this other thing instead. And like how deep is the insurance policies, getting into like, A, do you have the tool? B, which tool are you using? C, do you have the process in place? D, do you have like a third party, that can help you at scale,
Sure, sure. So the sophistication and the elegance of the underwriting is going to increase based on two things primarily. Um, the size of the client. Three things really: the size, the scope, and then the limit that's being asked for. Right. So I actually have an ongoing one right now with a SaaS AI company that works in the telecommunications space, and they now need to take their limit from 5 million occurrence aggregate to 10 million, 10 million to stay compliant with their contracts. The underwriting on this one has been pretty sophisticated. They're a decent sized local company. They work in telecommunications. They have SaaS and AI, and they're looking for $10 million of limit from that insurance company. So again, let's call back to earlier. If someone was asking you for a potential loan of $10 million, you might want to charge them some interest and have an idea of what's going on.
Make sure they can pay you back, right?
Here's the 10 mil, that's best of luck to you. That's a significant amount of money. So the underwriting on this one has been pretty sophisticated, but it will evolve based on the size, scope, and limit being asked for. So if you're asking for $1 million limit on a digital marketing firm that has $600,000 of gross receipts, you're not going to get a lot of heavy underwriting questions, right? And there's tools that they use too, right? So if you're familiar with like a BitSight or a security scorecard type outbound packet domain scan type tool, a lot of the carriers are using those as pre-underwriting tools now. It's not the be all end all, but it's something for them to potentially look at and say, are they at least trying
right.
to have a reasonably protected entity? Or is this thing really a mess, right? Based on that outbound packet perspective. You have certain instances where maybe a pen test becomes part of the underwriting process. And, if they're using that outbound packet perspective as pre-underwrite, and then they do a risk inspection with a pen test, now you've got a pretty good 360 view, right? You've got the outbound packet, you've got the inside the firewall. That's not a bad perspective to have, but it depends on the size, the scope, the limit being applied.
Right. Makes complete sense. Joe, thank you so much. This is fantastic. I enjoy getting, the other view of this always.
Well, thanks for having me on, Max. I appreciate it. Certainly a good time to chat with you. And I know that insurance gets a little bit of a perspective sometimes, but I can absolutely tell you there are good people within this industry that are really trying to use this product to help.
Absolutely.